The wind doesn't just blow across the Wyoming plains. It remembers. It remembers every secret buried in the soil, every promise that broke in the dark, every life that was about to change. And on one cold Tuesday, it carried a message straight to a lonely rancher named Warren Reeves, a man who'd built a life from hard work, not hope. He'd placed one desperate ad, told one painful truth, and expected nothing back. But then a letter arrived. "I accept your offer of marriage." A woman he'd never met was coming, Elena Bowman, with just one bag, a steady gaze, and a past she didn't speak aloud. In a town where whispers can ruin lives, one mistake could destroy them both. Because Warren was told he could never have children, and the moment Elena's future begins to change, the whole world will be ready to judge her. So the question is, will love survive the wind? Or will gossip tear it apart first? Lesson. Sometimes the bravest love isn't loud, it's the kind that stands firm when the whole world starts talking. Meaning, this story shows you how truth, respect, and loyalty can turn a second chance into a real home, no matter what people say. And if you want more stories that hit the heart and leave you with something real, drop a comment with your favorite moment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The wind came first. It swept across the Wyoming grassland like it had a message to deliver, and no patience left to wait. Cold, sharp, restless, the kind of wind that rattled bones and carried rumors from miles away. Folks out here said the land remembered everything, every broken promise, every buried dream. And on that evening, the wind seemed to know that one man's life was about to tilt off its careful balance. Warren Reeves stood alone inside his ranch house, boots planted on rough plank floors, worn smooth by years of quiet living. The lamp on the table flickered. Shadows crawled along timber walls that had never heard laughter, only wind and fire, and the long hush of night. The hearth behind him glowed with dying embers. But the real heat came from the letter in his hands, folded, creased, soft from being read too many times. He did not need to open it anymore. He knew every word by heart. Still, he unfolded it again, like touching a bruise just to be sure it was real. Careful handwriting, steady lines, brave strokes. "I accept your offer of marriage. I will arrive on the afternoon stage Tuesday next. Miss Elena Bowman." 6 weeks earlier, Warren had mailed that advertisement with a hand that shook. He had stared at the words until the ink blurred. He had told the truth. All of it. Even the part that had followed him like a shadow since his youth. A doctor. A fever. A sentence spoken too quickly. "You will never father children." Those words had shaped his life more than fences or storms ever had. A rancher who could not build a family was a man folks pitied, even if they never said it out loud. Warren had learned to live with that pity, learned to live alone. He had expected silence. He had expected rejection. He had never expected her. Now Tuesday had come. Warren folded the letter carefully and slid it into his vest pocket like it might break if handled rough. He took a long breath, the kind you take before stepping into deep water. All his life he had believed in work, in land, in keeping promises. He had never believed much in hope. Hope hurt too much when it left. Yet here it was, hope knocking on his door. He stepped outside, and the wind hit him hard, tugging at his coat like it wanted him to turn back. The sky stretched wide and pale, endless. The kind of sky that made a man feel small and honest. Warren hitched the wagon with steady hands. He did everything slow, careful, like moving too fast might scare this fragile thing away. The horses snorted clouds of steam into the cold air. He climbed onto the bench and snapped the reins. The ranch faded behind him. As the wagon rolled toward Casper, his hands stayed steady. Inside, nothing was steady at all. Fear sat beside him. Hope rode close behind. Love was a word he did not dare speak yet. Casper was loud. Wheels grinding through mud, men shouting, horses stamping. Life packed tight and restless. Warren reined in near the stage stop and climbed down. His boots sank into wet dirt. He wiped his palms on his coat without realizing he was doing it. Then he saw the stagecoach. And he saw her. Elena Bowman stood near the back door with a single carpet bag in her hand. That alone surprised him. Just one bag, like she was not running from anything. Like she had chosen this. Her traveling dress was dark blue, plain but neat. Her hat-shaded hair the color of ripened wheat. Her posture was straight, alert. She looked around like a woman measuring a place, not begging it to accept her. She did not look desperate. She did not look broken. She looked strong. Their eyes met. Something shifted in Warren's chest. He removed his hat. His voice came out low and rough, scraped raw by years of silence. "Miss Bowman, I am Warren Reeves." She studied his face for a brief moment. Not judging, just seeing. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "thank you for coming." No hesitation, no regret. The ride home began without ceremony. The wagon rattled over frozen ruts. The horses pushed forward through the cold. Warren kept his eyes on the road. He was afraid that if he looked at her too long, she might see how unsure he felt. Elena sat straight beside him, hands folded in her lap. She watched the land roll by with quiet interest. Endless grass. Sky so wide it swallowed everything beneath it. She smelled faintly of lavender soap. That small detail hit him harder than it should have. After miles of silence, Warren spoke. "The ranch is quiet. Not much to see but grass and sky. You will have your own room if you want. I do not expect anything before you are ready." He braced himself for disappointment, for a tightening around her eyes, for fear. Instead, she turned and met his gaze fully. "Thank you, Warren." The sound of his name on her tongue startled him, warmed him. "Yes," he murmured. "Warren is fine." The house came into view as the sun dipped low. Solid, plain, built to stand against wind and time. Its windows glowed softly like it was waiting. Warren helped her down from the wagon. Their hands brushed for a second. Just a second. But it sent a spark through him that he shook off quickly. Inside, the house was simple. Stone fireplace, long table, tin plates on shelves, a kitchen tucked into the corner. Elena walked slowly, taking it in. "It is more than I expected," she said. Relief loosened Warren's shoulders. "Your room is down the hall. Washroom outside. If you need anything, just ask." She noticed the nervous edge in his voice. Her eyes softened. "I will." They worked together on supper because Elena insisted. At first their movements were awkward, then they found a rhythm. He sliced bread. She ladled stew. When he apologized for the rough meal, she laughed. It was the softest laugh he had ever heard. Something inside him shifted. After they ate, she washed dishes. He dried. No one spoke. The silence felt warm, not heavy. When she said she would rest, Warren nodded and stepped back. "Sleep well, Elena. You too." Her door closed gently. Warren stood in the kitchen staring down the hall. He had lived alone so long that silence had become a friend. Tonight it felt different, lighter, hopeful. Across the hall, Elena leaned against her door, hand pressed to her chest. "He is kind," she whispered. "Lord help me." Days passed. Elena settled into ranch life with ease that surprised them both. She woke early, brewed coffee, cooked meals, hummed softly while she worked. Warren watched her without meaning to. He had built a house. She was building a home. Curtains filtered the morning light. Flowers softened the table. And sometimes, when she smiled at him across supper, Warren felt something dangerous rise in his chest. Hope. One morning she asked to learn how to ride. Warren saddled his gentlest mare. When the horse snorted, Elena yelped and he caught her by the waist. Their eyes met. Heat flared. They both looked away too fast. That night, neither slept. Winter tightened its grip outside. Inside the ranch house, a careful warmth grew, hesitant, real. Neither of them knew it yet, but the wind that crossed the plains had been right. Their lives were already changing. And this was only the beginning. The first real test was not the cold. The cold was honest. It bit your cheeks, stiffened your fingers, and reminded you that Wyoming did not hand out comfort for free. Warren could handle cold. He had handled it his whole life on this Wyoming ranch. The first real test was something quieter. It was the feeling of another heartbeat inside his walls. Elena moved through the house like she belonged there, but never like she owned it. She did not slam drawers. She did not stomp across the floor. She walked with a careful respect, as if she had been trained by years of watching her step. Warren noticed things he did not know how to name. How she paused before sitting, like she expected someone to tell her she was in the wrong chair. How she always offered to help even when she was already tired. How she looked up when the wind hit the windows, not afraid of the sound, but braced, like it might be a voice calling her back. On the third morning, he found her outside before dawn, bundled in his spare coat, feeding the chickens with a calm focus that made the whole yard feel different. "You are up early," he said. She turned, cheeks pink from the cold. "I have always been up early." Warren grunted, half amused. "Most folks in town would call that a flaw." Elena smiled, small and quick. "Most folks in town called me a lot of things." She said it like she was talking about weather, like she had learned that pain did not get lighter just because you named it. Warren felt something tighten in his chest. He had brought a mail-order bride to this Wyoming ranch. That was what folks would say if they knew. A mail-order bride, a bargain, a last resort. Warren hated that phrase. It sounded like a woman was a tool you ordered and unpacked. Elena did not feel like any tool. She felt like a person who had walked through fire and decided to keep going anyway. Later, when the coffee was hot and the sun was finally climbing, Warren cleared his throat and asked the question that had been sitting on his tongue for days. "Do you miss your home?" Elena stirred sugar into her cup, even though she had not asked for sugar. She did it slowly, watching the swirl. "No," she said. One word, flat, honest. Then she glanced up and added, "I miss pieces of it, not the whole." Warren nodded. That made sense. He missed pieces of things, too. A father's laugh, a mother's hands folding laundry, a brother's voice that had gone quiet too young. They ate breakfast without much talk. Warren was not a talker. Elena did not push. Yet the silence between them was changing. It was not empty anymore. It was simply unfilled. After breakfast, Warren stepped outside to split wood. He always split wood when his mind got too loud. The axe came down in clean, hard strokes. The rhythm soothed him. Behind him, the door opened. Elena walked out carrying a small basket. "I thought you might want something," she said. She held out a biscuit wrapped in cloth. Warren stared at it like it was something dangerous. "It is just a biscuit," she said, and there was a hint of teasing in her voice. He took it, careful not to touch her hand for too long. "Thank you." Elena hesitated. Then she pointed at the pile of chopped logs. "You split clean." "Not many men do." Warren huffed a short laugh. "Most men do not have much else to keep them company." Elena did not flinch. She simply nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. That afternoon she surprised him. He came back from the barn and found her at the table with his old ledger book open. The pages were filled with his handwriting, crooked, practical. Numbers and notes and little reminders about feed, repairs, and debts. Elena looked up, calm. "I hope you do not mind." "I was curious." Warren stepped closer, uneasy. That book was private. It was his life on paper. He expected her to close it fast. Instead, she turned the ledger toward him. "Some of these totals are off," she said softly. "Not by much, but enough that it will bite you later." Warren blinked. "Off." Elena nodded. "You are doing it in your head. You are tired. You are human." He stared at the page. She had corrected his sums in neat pencil marks. Clean. confident. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Elena shrugged. "My father ran a store. I kept the books. When he died, my uncle took over. He said women should not handle money. But he still liked the way I made the numbers behave." Warren did not know what to say to that. Injustice had 1,000 faces. Sometimes it wore a church smile. Sometimes it wore a family name. On this Wyoming ranch, Warren had believed he was the broken one, the man with the missing piece. Now he saw a different kind of breaking, the kind that came from being told again and again that you were small. Elena tapped the ledger. "If you want, I can keep it straight for you. No charge." "I like doing it." Warren should have refused. Pride told him to. Habit told him to keep his life locked up tight. But the truth was, this felt like a gift. "All right," he said, voice rough. "If you want." Elena smiled, and it lit something warm behind her eyes. "Thank you." That night, the wind rose hard. Snow hissed against the windows. Warren checked the barn twice, then came back inside and hung his coat by the door. Elena was by the stove, stirring a pot. She had rolled up her sleeves. Her hands moved with purpose, like she belonged in the warmth. Warren leaned against the wall and watched her before he could stop himself. She turned. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Watching like you are afraid I will vanish." Warren felt his face heat. He looked away. "I am not afraid." Elena stepped closer, not too close. The space between them mattered. It was a boundary and a bridge at the same time. "You put in that advertisement that you wanted honesty," she said. Warren swallowed. "Yes." "Then be honest," she said. "Are you scared?" The wind rattled the frame of the house like it wanted the answer, too. Warren took a long breath. "Yes." Elena nodded once, like she accepted it without judgment. "So am I," she said. Warren frowned. "Of what?" Elena looked down at her hands. "Of being wanted today and regretted tomorrow. Of being talked about like I am a shame you keep hidden. Of small-town gossip that follows you like a stray dog, even when you move 1,000 miles away." Warren stared at her, stunned by the plainness of it. "A mail-order bride," she added quietly. "That is what they would call me." Warren felt something flare in his chest, hot and sharp. "Let them call you what they want." Elena lifted her gaze. "It is easy to say when you are not the one they stare at." Warren stepped forward before he realized he was moving. He stopped a safe distance away. His voice came low. "I have been stared at," he said. "Not for the same reason. But I know the feeling. Folks look at a man who lives alone too long and they invent stories. Some say he is mean. Some say he is odd. Some say he is cursed." Elena tilted her head. "Are you?" Warren almost smiled. "Cursed." Elena gave him a look that was half challenge, half comfort. Warren exhaled. "I do not know. But I do know this. On this Wyoming ranch, you will not be anyone I hide. You will not be a shame. You will not be a secret." Elena did not speak for a moment. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "That is a dangerous promise," she said. Warren nodded. "I do not make promises I cannot keep." A soft silence settled. Then Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a strip of faded blue ribbon, frayed at the edges. "This was my mother's," she said. "She tied it in my hair when I was little, when things were good." Warren watched her fingers twist it gently, like the ribbon was a rope holding her steady. "I keep it to remember," she added. "Not everything was cruel." Warren hesitated, then reached into his own pocket. He pulled out an old pocket watch, scratched, heavy, still ticking. "My father's," he said. "It does not keep perfect time, but it keeps going." Elena studied it, then looked back at him. "Maybe that is the point," she said softly. "Not perfect, just going." Warren felt the wind outside, felt the cold, felt the distance from the world. Yet inside, the room felt warmer than the fire could explain. Over the next week, they found small ways to fit together. Elena learned the layout of the house. She learned which floorboard squeaked near the pantry. She learned that Warren drank his coffee black and too hot. She learned that he did not like too many words before sunrise. Warren learned that Elena hummed when she was nervous, that she cleaned when she was upset, that she could fix a torn shirt with fast, neat stitches that made his rough repairs look like a joke. One afternoon, Warren caught her outside practicing with his spare rifle. He stopped short. "Elena." She lowered it at once. "I am sorry. I should have asked." Warren stared at her, surprised. The rifle was steady in her hands, not shaky, not careless. "Where did you learn?" he asked. Elena shrugged, almost embarrassed. "My brother taught me before he left. He said a woman should know how to protect herself because men do not always do it for her." Warren felt a heavy truth settle in him. He walked over and checked the chamber. "Safe." He nodded once. "If you are going to shoot," he said, "then I will teach you proper." Elena blinked. "You will." Warren nodded. "On this Wyoming ranch, you learn what you want to learn." She smiled then. Not small, not polite, real. That evening they rode into Casper for supplies. Warren hated town. Too many eyes, too many voices, too many people who acted like they owned your business. Elena sat beside him, wrapped in her scarf, gaze calm but alert. The closer they got, the more Warren felt her body tighten slightly, like she was bracing for impact. At the general store, the first surprise came fast. A man near the counter stared at Elena too long, then leaned toward another man and whispered with a smirk. Warren did not hear the words. He did not need to. He knew the shape of cruel talk. Elena kept her chin up, but her fingers clenched around the strap of her bag. Small-town gossip, Warren thought. Even here it already had teeth. Warren stepped between Elena and the stairs. He looked straight at the man with the smirk. "Afternoon," he said, voice flat. The man blinked, then looked away. Elena exhaled softly. They bought flour, coffee, and lamp oil. Elena stayed close, not because she was weak, but because she was smart. You did not give strangers space to slice you open with their eyes. As they turned to leave, a woman near the door spoke in a sweet voice that was anything but sweet. "New wife, Mr. Reeves." Warren stopped. Elena froze. The woman smiled too wide. "I did not know you were courting." Warren met her gaze. "I was not courting. I was building a life." The woman looked Elena up and down. Brave of her. Elena did not flinch. "Yes," she said calmly, "it was." The woman laughed, light and sharp. "Well, welcome to Wyoming." Warren did not answer. He took Elena by the elbow and guided her outside. The wind hit them the moment they stepped into the street. Cold. Cutting. Elena kept walking until they were at the wagon. Then her breath shook. "Warren," she said quietly, "it has started." Warren frowned. What has? The looks, the talk, the small-town gossip. Warren climbed onto the bench and held out a hand to help her up. When her fingers touched his, he squeezed once. Gentle, firm. "Then we do not let it finish," he said. Elena looked at him, searching. Warren faced the road, jaw set. "You are my wife. This is our Wyoming ranch, and anyone who wants to spit poison can choke on it." Elena let out a shaky laugh. "That sounds like a threat." Warren gave a small, grim smile. "It is a promise." As they drove out of town, Elena watched the buildings fade behind them. Her shoulders loosened only when the open land returned, the wide sky, the honest wind. For a few miles, neither spoke. Then Elena said, almost to herself, "I did not come here to be pitied." Warren nodded. "Good, because I do not pity you." Elena turned. "What do you feel?" Warren hesitated, then answered with the only truth he had. I feel like I got a second chance. Elena watched him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the plains. So did I, she said. The wind rolled over the grass like a warning. Small town gossip had noticed them. And somewhere ahead, waiting in the weeks to come, was a test neither of them could see yet. But on that evening, on that long stretch of road back to the Wyoming ranch, Warren held the reins steady and kept his promise in his heart. He would not let the world make her small. Not again. Not ever. The first snow of deep winter came on a Sunday. It fell soft at first, like the sky was trying to be kind. Then the winter wind turned mean, and the flakes came sideways, stinging skin and swallowing tracks. By noon, the Wyoming ranch looked like a blank page. Fence posts vanished into white. The creek went silent under ice. Even the world felt like it was holding its breath. Inside the quiet house, the fire crackled steady. Elena sat near the hearth, mending a shirt with that same neat focus she gave everything. Warren sat across from her with a mug of coffee that had gone cold because he forgot to drink it. He kept watching her hands. Not in a rude way, in a way that startled him. Like her hands were proof she was real and he needed proof. The mail-order bride, folks would call her if they knew. Warren hated that phrase more every day. Elena was not a package. She was not a bargain. She was a living person on his Wyoming ranch, a person who carried her own scars. And somehow she was turning his quiet house into a place that could breathe. Still, he felt the pressure of small-town gossip even out here, like a coyote on the edge of the yard. Always listening, always waiting. Elena glanced up from her sewing. You are doing it again. Warren blinked. Doing what? Watching like you are measuring how much space I take up. He shifted, uncomfortable. I do not mean to. I know, she said softly. But you do. The winter wind tapped the window hard. A reminder, a warning. Warren stared into the flames for a long moment, then finally spoke. Elena, I have been thinking about that day in town. Small town gossip, she murmured. Yes, he said, small town gossip. He said the words like they tasted bitter. Small town gossip was poison with a smile. It could ruin a woman without ever laying a hand on her. It could turn a decent man into a joke. It could twist truth until nobody recognized it. Elena set her mending down carefully. I have been thinking about it too. Warren leaned forward, elbows on his knees. If you ever want to leave because of it, I will not stop you. Elena stared at him, surprised. You would let me go. Warren swallowed. I would hate it, but I will not trap you. I will not be another man who decides what you are allowed to do. Elena looked down at her hands. For a long time she did not speak. Then she said, quiet as falling snow, You are not like the men I knew. Warren gave a short, humorless laugh. I am just a lonely rancher who knows how to split wood and make bad stew. Elena almost smiled. You are a lonely rancher, yes. But you are not just that. Her gaze lifted, steady. You are a second chance. The words hit him so hard he forgot how to breathe for a beat. Second chance. That phrase had been following them like a shadow since the wagon ride home. Warren had felt it. Elena had said it. Now it sat between them, bold and fragile. Warren stared at her, throat tight. A second chance for what? Elena hesitated. For being seen. The fire popped. The quiet house seemed to lean closer, listening. Elena continued, voice careful. In my town, I was the woman people talked around. Not to my face. Around me. Like I could not hear. Like I did not have a heart. Small town gossip, she added again, and her mouth tightened. It was always there. At church, at the market, at my own table. Warren watched her, rage rising slow. Who? Elena shook her head. Names do not matter. The feeling does. Warren clenched his jaw. Names always matter. Elena met his eyes. Sometimes names are a chain. I do not want to drag them into this quiet house. Warren sat back, trying to steady himself. The quiet house. Their quiet house. That was still strange to think. He cleared his throat. You said you were tired of being invisible. Elena nodded. And you said you were tired of being alone. Warren looked down at his hands. A lonely rancher. That was him. It had been him for so long he forgot there could be anything else. He spoke without lifting his gaze. I wrote that advertisement because I thought if I told the truth, it would hurt less when nobody answered. Elena let out a small breath. But I answered. Warren nodded. And I still do not understand why. Elena leaned back in her chair. The ribbon she kept, her mother's ribbon, was tied around her wrist today like a quiet talisman. Warren noticed it and felt that old pocket watch heavy in his own vest, like it was ticking straight into his ribs. Elena said, Because you did not lie. Warren looked up. Elena held his gaze. Men in my town lied with their smiles. They said they wanted a wife, but what they meant was they wanted someone to obey them, someone to serve, someone to shrink. Warren swallowed. And you thought I would not. I thought you might not, she said. Your words were plain, honest. You admitted your fear. That is rare. That felt safe. Warren stared at the fire again, shaken by how much her trust meant. A second chance, a lonely rancher with a second chance sitting across from him. The winter wind howled outside. The Wyoming ranch felt like an island. Warren spoke, voice low. There is something else I need to tell you. Elena did not flinch. All right. Warren rubbed a hand over his jaw. I should have said it sooner. Elena waited. Patient. That patience made him feel both comforted and ashamed. Warren exhaled. When I wrote the advertisement, I told you the part about children. The doctor said I could never have them. Elena nodded once. I remember. Warren swallowed. I did not tell you how much that has controlled my life. Elena stayed quiet, eyes on him. Warren continued. Every time I saw a man with a son, it felt like a knife. Every time I heard a baby cry in town, I felt like the world was mocking me. Folks think a rancher wants land and cattle and whiskey, but what I wanted, the thing I did not let myself want, was a family. His throat tightened, but I made myself stop wanting it, because wanting it was pain. Elena's eyes softened. Warren. He shook his head. I am not saying this to make you feel sorry. I hate pity. I know, Elena said. Warren leaned forward again, voice rough. I am saying it because you deserve the full truth. I do not want you waking up one day realizing you gave your life to a lonely rancher who cannot give you what you might want. Elena stared at him, stunned. Warren waited for her to pull away, to look at him like he was broken, like the doctor's words were carved into his skin. Instead, Elena's voice came quiet. Do you think I came here for a cradle? Warren blinked. What? Elena shook her head. I came here because I wanted a life where I could breathe. I wanted a quiet house that did not crush me. I wanted a second chance. Warren swallowed, shaken, swallowed. But what if you want children later? Elena looked down at her ribbon, twisting it once. Then she looked back up. Warren, I do not know what the future will want from me, but I know what I want right now. Warren's pulse thudded hard. What? Elena's cheeks flushed slightly, but she did not look away. I want respect, she said. I want safety. I want a man who does not make me feel like a mistake. And I want to be chosen for who I am, not for what I can produce. The words landed heavy. Warren stared at her, chest tight with something he could barely name. Outside, the winter wind threw snow against the walls like fists. Inside, the quiet house held them steady. Warren said, I have never wanted to hurt you. I know, Elena whispered. Warren swallowed. Then why do I feel like I am standing on the edge of a cliff every time I look at you? Elena's breath caught. Because you care. Warren let out a short laugh that sounded more like pain. I care too much. Elena leaned forward slightly. Then do not fight it alone. Warren's eyes searched her face. You are not afraid of me. Elena shook her head. I am afraid of being unwanted. I am afraid of small-town gossip. I am afraid of waking up one day and finding out kindness was just another mask. Warren's jaw tightened. It is not a mask. Elena held his gaze like she was testing the truth with her eyes. Then she said, Show me. The room went still. Warren's heart hammered. He stood slowly, like any sudden movement might break the moment. He crossed the space between them and stopped beside her chair, close enough to feel her warmth, far enough to give her a choice. Elena tilted her face up. Warren's voice came out barely above a whisper. If I touch you, it will not be out of entitlement. It will be because I cannot keep pretending you do not matter. Elena's eyes glistened. Then do not pretend. Warren lifted a hand, slow, asking permission with every inch. His knuckles brushed her cheek. Elena leaned into this touch like she had been starving for gentleness. Warren's chest tightened. He had held animals, he had held tools, he had held grief, he had never held something like this. Elena reached up and covered his hand with hers, warm, steady. Warren bent slightly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. Their lips met in a soft, careful kiss. Not hungry, not rushed, just real. The kind of kiss that said, I see you. I believe you. When they parted, both of them were breathing like they had been running. Elena whispered, That did not feel like a mistake. Warren's voice shook. No. Elena rested her forehead against his for a moment. The quiet house seemed to sigh around them, as if it had been waiting for this. Warren closed his eyes. He thought of the Wyoming ranch outside, the snow, the winter wind. He thought of small-town gossip prowling in Casper. He thought of the phrase mail-order bride and how it made his stomach turn. Then he thought of Elena's voice saying second chance. He opened his eyes. Elena. Yes. Warren swallowed hard. I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to be a husband to a woman like you. Elena's mouth curved faintly. Then learn. Warren's laugh came out soft. That sounds like an order. Elena's eyes sparkled. Consider it a suggestion. Warren let himself smile. A real one. It felt strange on his face, like stretching a muscle he forgot he had. He helped her stand. They stayed close, hands still touching as if letting go would bring the cold back inside. Elena whispered, I should go to bed. Warren nodded, but he did not let go right away. He did not pull her in again either. He simply held her hand like it mattered. Sleep well, Elena. You too, Warren. She walked down the hall. At her door, she paused and looked back. The lamplight caught her face, making her seem both strong and suddenly young. Thank you, she said. For what? For not making me small, she said. Warren's throat tightened. The promise he made in town pressed against his ribs. Always, he said. Elena went into her room and closed the door softly. Warren stood in the hallway a long moment, listening to the winter wind. It sounded different tonight, less like a warning, more like the world shifting. He went back to his room and sat on the edge of the bed, the pocket watch heavy in his hand. It ticked steady, imperfect, stubborn. Keep going, it seemed to say. Warren stared at the wall, mind racing. A lonely rancher, a mail-order bride, a quiet house in the middle of a Wyoming ranch, small-town gossip waiting in the distance, and a second chance blooming right under his roof. He lay down, but sleep did not come. Because for the first time in years, Warren Reeves was not afraid of loneliness. He was afraid of losing what he had just begun to find. And somewhere deep in the dark, the wind kept moving, as if it already knew what was coming next. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came the way healing often does, slow, uneven. One warm afternoon followed by 3 bitter mornings. Patches of snow clung stubbornly to the north side of the barn, while the south side softened into mud. The Wyoming ranch woke in pieces. Inside the house, something new was growing too. Not loudly, not boldly, but steadily. After the night of the kiss, neither Warren nor Elena spoke of it right away. They did not need to. The air between them had changed. It carried meaning now. It carried memory. Warren found himself waking earlier than usual, listening for sounds that were not wind or creaking beams. The clink of a kettle, soft footsteps, a low hum drifting from the kitchen. Proof that he was not alone. Elena moved with more ease now. Not careless, just less guarded. She laughed a little more. She sat closer at the table. Sometimes when she passed behind him, her hand brushed his shoulder in a way that felt accidental but was not. Those small touches followed Warren through the day, in the barn, at the fence line, while mending tools. They grounded him and unsettled him all at once. One morning, Warren returned from checking the far pasture to find Elena kneeling by the creek, sleeves rolled up, hands in the cold water. "Elena," he called, "you will freeze yourself." She looked over her shoulder, smiling. "I am washing jars. They smelled like last summer." Warren walked closer. The creek had broken free of ice only days before. Water rushed fast and clear, swollen with snowmelt. He crouched beside her and took one jar from her hands. "You should have told me," he said. Elena raised an eyebrow. "And miss the adventure." Warren snorted. Adventure is a strange word for frozen fingers. She held her hands up, red but steady. Worth it. Warren shook his head, then surprised himself by reaching for her hands and rubbing them briskly between his palms. He meant to do it quickly, practically. He did not stop quickly. Elena looked up at him. Her breath caught just slightly. Warren realized what he was doing and froze. "Sorry," he said, releasing her at once. Elena flexed her fingers, warmth blooming back into them. "Do not be sorry." She stood, brushing off her skirt. "You are allowed to care, Warren." The words settled deep, allowed. It had never occurred to him that caring might need permission. They walked back to the house together, close enough that their arms brushed with each step. The Wyoming sky stretched wide above them, blue and unbothered. That afternoon, Warren decided to teach Elena to ride properly. He brought out his gentlest mare, a calm brown horse that had never spooked at thunder or gunfire. Elena eyed the saddle with determination and a hint of nerves. "If I fall," she said, "you will catch me." Warren gave a half smile. "That is the idea." He helped her up, hands firm on her waist. She wobbled when the mare shifted, and Warren steadied her instinctively. For a moment, the world narrowed to breath and balance, and the heat of her through layers of cloth. Their eyes met. Too long. Warren stepped back first. Elena cleared her throat. "All right. Tell me what to do." They spent the afternoon circling the pasture. Elena learned fast. She listened. She adjusted. When she laughed, it was loud and unguarded, carried by the open land. Warren leaned against the fence and watched her ride under the wide Wyoming sky. This woman had arrived with one bag and a careful heart. Now she moved like she belonged here, like the land had been waiting for her, too. That thought frightened him, because belonging made losing hurt more. Small-town gossip did not stay in town. It traveled on the wind. A week later, Warren rode into Casper alone for supplies. Elena had stayed home to bake bread and tend the garden she had started near the house. Warren told himself he preferred it that way. Less eyes on her, less talk. At the general store, he felt the shift the moment he walked in. Conversation dipped. Heads turned. A man near the counter nodded at him slowly. "Warren Reeves." "Afternoon," Warren said. The man smirked. "Heard you finally settled down." Warren kept his face neutral. "That is one way to put it." "Must have been hard," the man continued. Finding a woman willing to live way out there. Warren felt his jaw tighten. She chose it. The man chuckled. Brave girl. The word brave landed wrong. Warren paid for his goods and left without another word. Outside, the Wyoming wind cut sharp. He breathed it in like it might cool the anger under his skin. On the ride home, his thoughts churned. Brave girl. Mail order bride. Settled down. They talked like Elena was a gamble. A last resort. A story to pass around for entertainment. Warren's hands tightened on the reins. When he reached the ranch, the smell of fresh bread hit him before he even stepped inside. Elena stood at the counter, flour on her cheek, humming. She looked up and smiled. "You are back early." Warren forced his expression to soften. Town was busy. Elena studied him for a moment. "You ran into something?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing worth repeating." Elena nodded, but her eyes stayed thoughtful. That night, after supper, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The land glowed gold and green, new life pushing through old scars. Elena rested her elbows on her knees. Warren sat beside her, close enough to feel her warmth. She spoke without looking at him. "People talk, do not they?" Warren sighed. "Yes." Elena nodded. "I can feel it sometimes, even out here, like a pressure." Warren stared out at the horizon. "I will not let it touch you." Elena finally turned to him. "You cannot fight the whole world." Warren met her gaze. "I do not need to. I only need to fight for you." The words surprised them both. Elena's breath caught. "Warren," he continued, voice steady. "I am not ashamed of you. I will never be." Elena's eyes glistened. "That matters more than you know." They sat in silence after that, hands resting close but not touching. Inside, something deepened. Not just affection, not just comfort. Commitment. Weeks passed. Spring strengthened. The garden grew. Elena's laughter came easier. Warren found himself planning days instead of just surviving them. They began sharing a bed, slowly, carefully. No rush, no entitlement. Just warmth and trust, and learning the shape of each other in the dark. Warren held Elena at night, her back against his chest, her breathing steady. He did not push. He did not take. He simply stayed. Elena felt safe in a way she never had before. But safety, like all good things, can make fear louder. One morning, Elena woke before dawn with her stomach twisting. She told herself it was nerves, or the bread she ate late, or the cold air. It passed. The next day, it returned. By the third morning, she knew something was wrong. She moved through the house quietly, pressing a hand to her stomach when Warren was not looking. She forced herself to eat, forced herself to smile. Warren noticed anyway. "You are pale," he said one evening. Elena shook her head too quickly. "I'm fine." Warren frowned. "You have been saying that a lot." Elena busied herself with the dishes. "I am just tired." Warren did not press, but he watched. Days later, Elena stood alone in her room, staring at her reflection. Her dresses felt tighter. Her body felt different, heavy in a way that scared her. "No," she whispered. "Not this. Not now." Fear wrapped around her ribs like wire. She had come here believing she was broken in one way. Warren had believed he was broken in another. Their fragile peace rested on that shared understanding. If it was wrong, if something had changed, everything could fall apart. Elena lay awake that night, listening to Warren's breathing. She curled inward, hands pressed protectively against herself. She did not know yet what was growing, but she knew deep in her bones that something had begun, and that knowledge terrified her. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through new grass. whispering secrets it was not ready to give up. Fear did not arrive all at once. It came in small, humiliating ways. It came with the smell of coffee turning her stomach before the kettle even finished boiling. It came with the way bacon grease made her gag. It came with the exhaustion that clung to her bones, no matter how early she went to bed or how late she slept. Elena learned quickly how to hide it. She pushed food around her plate. She blamed the cold. She blamed poor sleep. She blamed anything that did not force her to say the words out loud. Because once spoken, they could not be taken back. Warren noticed. He noticed because he had spent years paying attention to quiet things, to animals that limped just slightly, to fences that leaned before they fell, to storms that announced themselves with a shift in air long before the sky darkened. Elena moved like someone carrying a secret too heavy for her frame. One evening, as she stood at the stove stirring soup she had no interest in eating, Warren spoke carefully. "You have not finished a full meal in days." Elena stiffened. "I am just not hungry." Warren stepped closer. "You love this soup?" She forced a smile without turning around. "Tastes change." Warren watched her shoulders rise and fall. Her breathing was shallow, controlled. "Elena," he said softly, "you do not have to carry everything alone." She closed her eyes. That was the problem. If she let go, everything would spill. "I am fine," she repeated, and this time the words sounded like a plea. Warren did not push, but he did not believe her. The Wyoming wind rattled the windows that night. Elena lay awake beside him, staring into the dark. Warren slept lightly, one arm draped protectively around her waist. She pressed her lips together to keep from crying. If she was right, if her fear had a name, then nothing would ever be the same again. Days passed. Elena began letting out the seams of her dresses in secret. She hid the loose thread beneath her pillow. She stood sideways in the mirror and told herself she was imagining it. She was not imagining it. Her body was changing, quietly, relentlessly. She stopped drinking coffee altogether. Warren noticed but said nothing. He noticed everything but chose his moments carefully. When a traveling doctor came through Casper in early March, Warren seized the chance. He mentioned it casually over breakfast. "Dr. Franklin Choi is in town. He does not come often." Elena's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. Warren watched her face pale. "Maybe you should see him," he added gently, "just to be sure." Elena swallowed hard. "I do not need a doctor." Warren's voice stayed calm. "You do not usually say that." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Elena whispered, "All right." Her hands shook as she pulled on her coat. Warren pretended not to see. The trip into town felt longer than usual. The road was muddy from thawing ground. The wagon creaked. The horses snorted impatiently. Warren kept glancing at Elena, who sat rigid beside him, hands clenched in her lap. "You do not have to be afraid," he said. She turned to him, eyes shining. "I am not afraid of the doctor." Warren frowned. "Then what?" Elena looked away. "I am afraid of what comes after." Warren did not press. He helped her down from the wagon outside the store where the doctor had set up his temporary office. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and damp wool. A thin curtain separated the examination area from the rest of the room. Warren squeezed Elena's hand once before she disappeared behind it. "I will be right here," he said. Elena nodded. Her legs felt weak. Behind the curtain, Dr. Choi spoke kindly, asked questions, pressed gently, listened. Then he straightened. "Mrs. Reeves," he said carefully, "how long have you been feeling this way?" Elena's breath hitched. "Weeks." He nodded. "I thought so." She stared at him, heart pounding. "Thought so about what?" Dr. Choi folded his hands. "You are with child. About 3 months along." The words slammed into her. "With child." The room tilted. Her ears rang. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. "No," she whispered. "That is not possible." The doctor frowned. "I assure you, it is." Tears blurred her vision. But my husband. He was told he could not. The doctor sighed. Medicine changes. Diagnoses are sometimes wrong. The body has its own truths. Elena barely heard him. Fear flooded her veins like ice water. She was pregnant. She stumbled out from behind the curtain, barely aware of the world around her. Warren stood at once when he saw her face. "Elena," he said urgently. "What did he say?" She could not speak. He helped her to the wagon, his hands steady, even as his eyes filled with worry. "Please, Warren, let us go home," she whispered. "Not until you tell me," he said softly but firmly. The words burst out of her like a wound. "I am pregnant." The reins slipped from Warren's hands. "What? I am pregnant," she repeated, tears streaming down her face. 3 months. The doctor said 3 months. Warren stared at her like the world had cracked open. Impossible. The word echoed in both their minds. The wagon rolled forward slowly as Warren gathered the reins with shaking hands. Neither spoke. The Wyoming plains stretched wide and indifferent around them. Fear rose like a storm cloud. When they finally stopped, Warren turned to her. "Elena," he said hoarsely, "are you saying—" "I would never betray you," she cried. "Never! I swear it! I swear on everything I am!" Warren reached for her at once, pulling her close. "I know that," she sobbed against his chest. "But others will not. They will talk. They will say I tricked you, that I lied." Warren's jaw tightened. "Let them!" Elena pulled back, eyes wild. "You do not understand. Women are ruined by whispers. I have seen it. I have lived it." Warren cupped her face in his hands. "I know you. That is enough." But doubt flickered in her eyes. "What if you doubt me later?" Warren did not hesitate. "I will not. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever." The certainty in his voice shocked her. Elena collapsed against him, shaking. "I am so afraid." Warren held her tight. "You do not have to be afraid alone." The wagon rolled again. The Wyoming wind carried their silence all the way home. But inside that silence lived a truth neither of them could escape. Everything had changed, and the greatest test of their fragile love had just begun. The Wyoming plains did not care. The grass kept bending in the wind. The sky kept turning from pale blue to gray and back again. The horses needed feeding. The fire needed tending. Life kept moving forward as if nothing had cracked open inside the Reeves house. But inside, everything felt different. Fear sat at the table with them. Fear lay between them at night. Fear followed Elena like a shadow she could not shake. In the days after the doctor's visit, Elena moved quietly, like she was afraid of taking up space. She ate little, slept little. Her hands drifted off into her stomach, resting there protectively when she thought Warren was not looking. Warren noticed every time. He tried not to stare, tried not to let his worry turn into pressure. But the truth was, he did not know how to protect her from something he could not punch or chase away. Small-town gossip was not a man you could confront. It was a fog. It slipped through cracks. It crept under doors. One afternoon, Warren returned from the far fence line to find Elena standing at the window, staring out at nothing. "Elena." She startled slightly. "Oh, I did not hear you." "You have been doing that a lot," he said gently. She nodded. "I keep thinking I hear voices." Warren frowned. "Voices?" She gave a sad smile. "Not real ones. The ones I remember. The ones that say a woman like me should know better. That she should disappear quietly when she becomes inconvenient." Warren felt anger burn low in his chest. "No one gets to tell you that." Elena turned to him. "They already have, long before I ever met you." Warren stepped closer. He wanted to hold her, but he waited. He was learning that sometimes waiting was love. "I am not ashamed," he said. "I want you to hear that again. I am not ashamed of you, or of our child." Elena's breath shook. "But what if they are ashamed of you?" Warren shrugged. That is their burden, not mine. She studied his face, searching for doubt. She did not find it. That almost scared her more than anger would have. That night, sleep did not come easily. Elena lay stiff beside him, staring into the dark. Warren could feel it, the tension, the distance fear created. After a long while, she whispered, "Warren." "Yes. What if the baby does not look like you?" The question landed like a stone. Warren inhaled slowly. "Then, I will love it anyway." Elena's voice broke. "That is not what I mean." Warren rolled onto his side to face her. "I know what you mean," she swallowed. "What if people say it proves everything they think about me?" Warren reached out and brushed her hair back gently. "Then let them say it." Elena squeezed her eyes shut. "I cannot live under that." Warren's jaw tightened. "You will not have to. I will stand between you and it." Elena let out a quiet sob. "You cannot stand between me and the whole world." Warren pressed his forehead to hers. "I can stand with you." That was not the same thing, but it was all he could promise. The next morning, Elena did not come to breakfast. Warren waited. Then he waited some more. Finally, he went down the hall. Her door stood open. The room was half packed. Her carpet bag lay open on the bed. Dresses folded inside. Careful. Final. Elena stood beside the wardrobe, hands shaking as she tried to keep them steady. "Elena," he breathed. She turned slowly. Her eyes were red, determined, broken. "I think I should leave." The words punched the air from his lungs. "Leave," he said hoarsely. "Why?" She pressed her lips together, fighting tears. "Because if I stay, people will talk. They will tear you apart. They will ruin your name. They will say the child is not yours." Warren crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her hands gently but firmly. "Look at me," he said. She resisted, then met his eyes. "I will not let you walk away from me, from our child, or from this home we are building." Her breath hitched. "But what if the baby proves them right?" Warren's voice hardened. "Then they can come say it to my face." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I do not want to ruin your life." Warren cupped her face, steady and sure. "Then stay in it." The words hung between them. He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she might disappear if he loosened his grip. "Do not leave," he whispered into her hair. "Please, I need you. Our baby needs you." Elena clung to him, sobbing softly. "I will not leave. I will not." They stood there a long time, breathing each other in, while the Wyoming wind moved outside like a restless witness. That night, Elena slept curled against him, exhausted. Warren stared at the ceiling long after she drifted off. He had never been afraid of hard work. He had never been afraid of storms. But this was a different kind of fight. And it was not over yet. 2 weeks passed after the night Elena nearly left. They were quiet weeks, careful weeks. Elena stayed. She kept her promise. But fear did not leave with it. It settled deeper, like frost beneath soil that still looked green on the surface. Warren watched her closely. Not like a guard. Like a man memorizing something precious, because he did not trust the world to let him keep it. Elena tried to be brave. She worked in the garden until her back ached. She cooked meals even when the smell turned her stomach. She smiled when Warren looked at her, though sometimes it trembled at the edges. At night she slept with one hand over her stomach and the other tucked into Warren's shirt like an anchor. Warren learned how to listen to silence differently. Some silences meant peace. Some meant pain. This one meant waiting. Then the letter came. It arrived on a gray morning when the sky hung low and heavy. Warren had just come in from the mailbox at the end of the drive, shaking snow from his coat. He sorted the mail absently at the table. Feed order, catalog. Then an envelope that made his stomach drop. The return address was familiar. Dr. Inega. The same doctor who had spoken the words that had haunted Warren for years. The same doctor who had told him with calm authority that he could never father children. Warren stared at the envelope. Elena noticed at once. Her hand froze mid-motion as she kneaded dough. "Warren," she whispered. "What is it?" He swallowed. "From the doctor." Her face drained of color. She set the bowl down slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter something fragile. "Open it," she said quietly. Warren's fingers trembled as he broke the seal. The letter was short. No unnecessary words. No apology big enough to match the years it had taken from him. But it was enough. "Dr. Reeves, I am writing regarding your diagnosis from several years ago. New medical understanding has shown that such conclusions were often made without sufficient certainty. I believe my earlier assessment may have been incorrect. Your condition was never absolute. You may have always been capable of fathering children." Warren stared at the page. The room tilted. For a moment there was no sound, no wind, no fire crackle, no breath. Then he laughed. It burst out of him wild and broken, half joy, half grief, half disbelief. It scared Elena so badly she rushed to him at once. "Warren?" He dropped the letter and grabbed her, pulling her into his lap, burying his face against her neck. "He was wrong," Warren whispered. "All these years, he was wrong." Elena's hands flew to his shoulders. "Warren, what are you saying?" He pulled back enough to look at her, eyes bright with tears. "There was never anything wrong with me," he said, "and there was never anything wrong with you." Elena stared at him. The meaning crashed into her slowly. Then all at once. "This is our child," she broke. Relief tore through her so fast she sobbed openly, clutching him as if the world had finally stopped spinning. "Ours," Warren said fiercely. "This child is ours." He held her like she was the answer to every prayer he never dared speak. The Wyoming wind howled outside, but inside the house something long frozen finally cracked and flowed free. That afternoon, Warren rode into Casper with his head high. For the first time since Elena arrived, he did not care who saw him or what they thought. At the general store, the same men were there. The same curious glances, the same hungry silence waiting for weakness. Warren did not give it any. He stood tall at the counter, voice clear. "I have news," he said. Heads turned. "My wife is expecting a child, and it is mine." The room froze. One man cleared his throat. "Thought you could not." Warren met his eyes without flinching. Turns out the doctor was wrong. Silence stretched. Then a murmur. Then another. Some nodded, some looked away. Some smiled thin and tight. Warren did not care. He had already won. When he returned home, Elena was sitting on the porch, sunlight warming her face. She looked up when she saw him, hope and fear tangled in her eyes. "Well?" she asked. Warren smiled. "Let them talk. The truth is louder." Elena exhaled, shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. Spring arrived fully after that. The land thawed. Grass pushed through dead ground. The creek ran clear and strong. Elena's belly began to show, round and undeniable. Warren watched her with awe, like he was witnessing a miracle he had been denied his whole life. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset bleed gold across the hills, Warren took her hand. "Marry me," he said quietly. Elena blinked. "We are already married." Warren shook his head. "Not like this. Not the way you deserve." She searched his face. "I want a real wedding," he continued. "A preacher. Witnesses. I want to choose you in front of the whole world." No whispers, no doubt. Tears filled her eyes. "A proper wedding. Let me give you that," he whispered. Elena squeezed his hand. "Yes." The wind moved through the grass like applause. Word traveled faster than spring runoff. By the time Warren and Elena rode into Casper the following week, most folks already knew. Some knew the truth. Some twisted it. Some only knew enough to be curious. Small-town gossip never vanished. It simply changed shape. This time Warren did not shrink from it. He rode with Elena beside him, his hand resting openly on her back. Her belly showed now, unmistakable beneath her dress. There was no hiding, no apologizing. They stopped at the general store first. Warren needed supplies. Elena wanted to face the place that had once filled her with dread. When they stepped inside, conversation slowed. A few heads turned away, a few lingered. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Caldwell, the same woman who had once greeted Elena with a smile too sharp to be kind, stepped forward. Elena felt her shoulders tighten. Mrs. Caldwell studied her for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I hear congratulations are in order." Elena blinked. "Yes." Mrs. Caldwell nodded. "I suppose I misjudged you. It was not an apology. But it was something." Warren said nothing. He simply stood beside his wife, solid and calm. That was the pattern now. Some offered kindness late, some offered silence. Some never changed at all. But the power had shifted. The wedding took place 2 weeks later. Not grand, not flashy, but real. They chose the creek on the edge of the ranch where cottonwood trees leaned together like old friends. The water ran clear and bright. Birds called from the branches. The Wyoming sky stretched wide and blue. Elena sewed her own dress, white, simple, made to fit her growing belly. She stood tall in it, unashamed. Warren wore his best suit. It smelled faintly of cedar and work and home. Neighbors came, a few from town, some from miles away. People who had watched Warren live alone for years, people who had whispered and wondered. Now they watched something else. The preacher spoke plainly, about choosing, about standing firm when the world pushed back, about love that grew not from convenience but from courage. When he said, "You may kiss your bride," Warren did not hesitate. He kissed her with the kind of promise that did not need words. "You are mine now," he whispered. "I was always yours," Elena replied. Afterward there was food, laughter, awkward dancing, children running barefoot near the creek. Elena laughed freely. Warren smiled like a man reborn. That night, as the guests drifted away and the stars came out sharp and bright, they sat together on the porch. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how close I came to leaving?" she asked. Warren nodded. "Warren, every day." Elena smiled softly. "I am glad I stayed." "So am I," he said. The baby came in early autumn. A boy, loud, strong, with Warren's dark hair and Elena's clear blue eyes. Warren cried harder than the child. He held his son like he was holding proof. Proof that broken things could be mended. Proof that fear could be faced and beaten. They named him Samuel. Life did not slow down after that. It grew. A daughter followed. Then twin boys. The house that once echoed with silence filled with footsteps and laughter and arguments and joy. The Wyoming ranch thrived. Years passed. The land aged. Warren's hair grayed. Elena's laughter deepened. Small-town gossip faded into memory. One evening, many years later, grandchildren played in the yard as the sun dipped low. Elena leaned into Warren's side. "We did well," she said. Warren smiled. "Better than well." The wind moved gently across the grass, no longer a warning, just a witness. Time has a way of softening sharp edges. It does not erase what hurt. It does not pretend the storm never came. It simply teaches you how to live after it. On the Wyoming ranch, seasons turned as they always had. Spring brought calves and green grass. Summer brought long days and tired laughter. Autumn brought harvest and early dusk. Winter came quieter now, less lonely. The house learned new sounds. Children running down the hall, boots kicked off by the door, voices calling out for supper. Warren often paused in the middle of his work just to listen. Once he would have given anything for silence. Now silence felt wrong, like something missing. Elena moved through the house with confidence born of years, not caution. Her hair grayed at the temples, but her eyes still held that steady fire. She knew where every drawer creaked, where every board dipped underfoot. She had not just made a home, she had claimed it. On quiet afternoons, she sat by the window sewing while grandchildren played outside. Sometimes one of them would wander in, crawl into her lap, and ask for a story. She always told them the same one, about a woman who went west with one bag and a brave heart, about a man who thought he was broken, about a house that learned how to breathe. She never spoke of small-town gossip. She never named the cruelty. She did not need to. Warren listened from the doorway more than once, pretending to check a hinge or a latch. Every time his chest tightened with the same quiet wonder. This was his life. At night, when the house finally settled, Warren and Elena sat together on the porch. The land stretched dark and wide before them. The same land that once felt empty now felt full. "Do you ever think about the man you were?" Elena asked one evening. Warren considered. The lonely rancher, the man who believed a doctor's words more than his own worth. "Yes," he said. "I do." Elena smiled. "Would you tell him anything if you could?" Warren stared out at the stars. "I would tell him not to mistake fear for truth." Elena nodded. "That is a good lesson." Warren glanced at her. "You taught me that." She rested her head on his shoulder. "You were ready to learn." They sat in silence after that, hands intertwined, listening to the wind move through grass that had seen everything. Years later, when Warren's hands shook too much to mend fence wire, and Elena's steps slowed on the stairs, nothing truly felt lost. Because what mattered had already been built. They had built trust. They had built courage. They had built a future when neither believed they deserved one. And the ranch remembered. It remembered laughter where there had been none. It remembered love planted in hard soil and growing anyway. As the sun sank low, casting everything in gold, Elena squeezed Warren's hand. "We dreamed together," she said. "That is why it worked," Warren replied. The last winter Warren truly feared was the one he lived alone. Every winter after that was just weather. Snow still came. Wind still howled across the Wyoming plains. Fence posts still groaned under ice. But inside the house there was always a light in the window. Always a kettle warming. Always a voice calling his name. In the end, Warren and Elena did not win by becoming perfect. They won by refusing to let fear decide their story. One summer evening, many years after the wedding by the creek, the yard was crowded with life. Children chased each other through tall grass. A pair of teenagers argued near the barn, then laughed like it was the same thing. Grandchildren ran up the porch steps, shouting questions too fast for any adult to answer. Elena sat in her porch chair, a quilt across her knees. Warren sat beside her, his hand resting over hers. Their fingers were slower now, their joints stiffer. But the way they held each other had not changed. It was steady. It was certain. A little girl climbed into Elena's lap and pointed at Warren's old pocket watch hanging from his vest chain. "Why does Grandpa always wear that?" she asked. Elena smiled and tucked a strand of hair behind the child's ear. "Because it reminds him to keep going." Warren chuckled softly. "And because your grandma likes it." The girl giggled and ran off again. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in warm gold and soft pink. The wind moved through the grass gently, no longer sharp, no longer warning. Elena leaned her head on Warren's shoulder. "We did well," she said softly. Warren looked at the yard full of voices, at the house glowing behind them, at the land that had once felt like a prison, and now felt like a promise. "Better than well," he murmured. Elena turned her face toward him. "Do you remember the first night I arrived? How quiet it was." Warren nodded. "I remember standing in the kitchen after you went to your room, thinking silence was all I had." Elena's voice grew tender. "And now?" Warren's eyes softened. Now I cannot imagine a life without noise." She laughed, warm and full of years. "You used to sleep, Warren Reeves." He smiled. "And now I dream," he said. They sat like that as the light faded, hands intertwined, listening to their family move around them like a living song. And if there was a lesson in their story, it was not complicated. Truth can hurt, but lies rot you from the inside. Fear can shout, but love can outlast it. And being told you are broken does not make it true. Sometimes all it takes is one brave choice, one letter, one wagon ride, one steady hand reaching out instead of pulling away. On a porch full of voices, on a ranch full of life, Warren and Elena proved what the wind had known from the start. Their story did not end with doubt. It ended with home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.